Excellent. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for making the time to join our webinar today. We're really excited to dig in and talk about risk management today, tools and best practices to identify, manage, and mitigate risk. And we'll be digging into our new risk module in AMP Impact. We've got myself, Zach Kaufman from Vera Solutions, and Maya Winkelstein from Open Road Alliance, who will introduce herself and their work in a few minutes. So I'll quickly kind of move ahead, and if we go to the next slide, we can kind of set the stage. So overall here, what we're working to do is really working to maximize impact, as we all are working in the social impact space, by using risk management and kind of making risk management a more common practice in philanthropy and across the social sector. Maya and I, as we were talking about this, she shared a really interesting insight that risk right now is sort of where impact measurement was maybe a decade ago. And we really think that there's a lot of room for growth and improvement across the sector. And we're excited to be working in this space. For me and for the Vera team, it's been a real learning opportunity as we've been working on this initiative with Open Road Alliance and a few other foundations. We're really excited to share with you kind of the outputs of that and where we're at now, and hopefully get some input from you guys on what you're seeing. So just a quick run of show. So we'll do some quick introductions and a bit of background to this. So both talking about Vera, AMP Impact, Open Road Alliance, and then also talking a little bit about why we build on Salesforce and why we've built out this solution on Salesforce. Second, we'll go back to school. So Maya will take us to school on a bit of risk management 101, unpacking definitions and theories and gaps and trends in the risk space. Then we will move into kind of talking a bit about how we've designed a new Salesforce-based risk management tool within AMP Impact. And then I will do a bit of a live demo of that new tool, which we're really excited to share with you all today. And just to mention, we're recording this call, we're recording this webinar, which we'll be sharing the link. So if you have any colleagues that were not able to join, we'll circulate the link afterwards, and feel free to pass it on to them. Great. So a little bit of background about Vera Solutions and the work that we do. So we're a mission-driven social enterprise working globally. So our mission is amplifying the impact of the social sector using cloud and mobile technology. We grew out of a nonprofit in South Africa 9 years ago, and I've been really working with organizations all around the globe since then to help them improve their program management, grant management, monitoring evaluation, their supply chain management, how they engage with their constituents, and so forth. We've grown to a team of over 70 staff and are working in, have teams kind of across 5 continents. We've worked with about 300 organizations since we got started, actually just over 300 organizations since we got started. And the next slide, just to give you kind of a flavor of them, it's a big, really diverse mix of organizations, from grassroots organizations delivering programs in the field to international NGOs like the Norwegian Refugee Council and PACT, and Finn Church Aid, for example, as well as with a growing number of funders, foundations, and other sorts of grant makers, like the Gavi Alliance, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, Skoll Foundation, and the Elton John AIDS Foundation. So that's a little bit about us. Now, why do we build on Salesforce? So the truth be told, Vera isn't married to Salesforce. We just think it's the best tool out there for solving the kinds of problems that we're working to solve. So Salesforce, if you don't know it, many of you, I'm guessing, do. It's the world's #1 cloud computing platform. What we think is most important about Salesforce really is the ecosystem around it. You've got 150,000 companies using Salesforce, over 40,000 nonprofits using it. Just about everything can be configured through clicks, not code, which is really important when you're thinking about how are we going to sustain and maintain a system that we put in place. It's a very configurable platform. Salesforce is consistently selected as one of Forbes' most innovative companies because they're just constantly improving the platform. They have 3 major releases every year. They're really listening to their customers and dedicated to making the platform better and better. And as many of you may know, if you're already using Salesforce, you can really get quite great value in licenses as a nonprofit with the Power of Us discount and donation program. And so that's, I think, why Salesforce has just been has widely penetrated in the nonprofit sector. Another look at kind of why we build on Salesforce is this slide, which seems a little hectic, but basically you have all these different layers of configurable features within on top of the Salesforce platform. So at the core, people often think about Salesforce as a CRM. At Vera, we think about it at the core really as a relational database platform, which means that you can really manage any kind of data on Salesforce, not just your relationships and your contacts and your accounts and your donations, but actually you can use it to manage your grant portfolios. You can use it to manage your indicators and your objectives and your results. And as we'll talk about today, you can also use it to manage risk registers and risks and risk assessments. Another important piece is the automation layer. So when something happens in Salesforce, the platform can fire out an email or request approval from certain people depending on the rules that you configure in. And again, all of that can be built without writing any code, which is pretty amazing. You got a really flexible user interface, so you can kind of drag and drop the interface to make it look the way that you want it to look. You got a powerful analytics layer to with drag and drop report builders and dashboard builders to be able to quickly create analytics that answer questions that you might have on a recurring basis through a dashboard that's going to refresh itself and come to your inbox on a weekly basis, let's say, or questions that you have on an ad hoc basis where you just really need to understand and do kind of a deeper analysis of your data. There's a great mobile app that comes with the platform. So as you configure once for the cloud, you also have access to all of that on your mobile device, as all of your users do. And integration is something we're just seeing so many organizations need. Getting one platform to talk to other platforms and being able to push data out from Salesforce or bring data into it. Very robust set of APIs, so that's all important. Underlying all of this, I'm not going to go into everything there, but you have kind of world-class security and communities. You can kind of build out portals and so forth. But happy to chat more about kind of why we build on Salesforce if people want to know more about it. And then just a quick plug sort of on that topic, we just published a piece a couple weeks ago on the 3 big questions and the 10 criteria that we see organizations looking for in a technology platform or technology tool. And so I won't talk about each of these, but just to worth checking out our blog. That piece has gotten a lot of traction, and a number of folks have told us that they found that really useful in thinking through how to select a tool or a platform. And suffice it to say that I think one of the reasons that we at Vera really like to build on Salesforce is because it just performs very well across all of these criteria. It's a really balanced platform that's incredibly flexible, has a great ecosystem, super interoperable, and it is becoming more and more user-friendly every year. So that's a quick snapshot of who Vera is and kind of why we build on Salesforce. AMP Impact is basically a package solution that we've built on top of Salesforce for impact measurement and portfolio management. So on the next slide, just a quick kind of backstory to how we got to AMP Impact. So of course we started Vera 9 years ago. We started doing portfolio management projects on Salesforce about 8 years ago. And we started seeing over the next few years a bunch of common needs and patterns and particularly common data structures for organizations that were doing portfolio management, had needs for portfolio management and then impact measurement at a portfolio level. And so we started designing a package solution because frankly, we got sick of building the same thing over and over again. And it just wasn't the most efficient way for us to work and wasn't the most efficient for our clients. So in 2014 and 2015, we started designing AMP Impact. We launched it on the Salesforce App Exchange in late 2017. It's now being used in over 50 countries to manage portfolios of over $600 million of programs and grants. And really excited that this week we actually just had our 10th release of AMP Impact. We're doing about 3 releases per year, similar to Salesforce. And what I'll be walking you through today with the risk module is actually something that came out in this new 10th release of AMP Impact. So that's the backstory to AMP Impact, and I'll pass the mic over to Maya from Open Road Alliance to tell a little bit about them and why risk is so important and what we should be doing more in the risk management space.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Zach, and thank you to everyone for joining us for the webinar today. I'm really pleased to be here and really excited to have this sort of culmination of partnership between Vera Solutions, AMP Impact, and Open Road Alliance. So Open Road Alliance was established in 2012 to keep impact on track. In the world of the impact sector, we are a funder. We provide fast grants and loans to nonprofits and social enterprises that for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to call our risks realized. And what does that really mean? Well, it comes from the simple thesis that the world is unpredictable. And the social sector, the impact sector, is actually not immune to the uncertainty and predictability inherent in the world around us. And yet, we also know that our sector, both funders and implementers, are pretty underprepared to deal with this reality. And to give you a sense of what I mean, this is a representation of over 100 empirical examples of what actually goes wrong and has gone wrong over the last 5 years in a variety of impact products. So this could be in the health sector, the agricultural sector, the tech for good sector, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in the United States. Things go wrong all the time. And yet we're simply not prepared. And this is because risk management as a practice is generally not integrated into our grant making practices the same way that monitoring and evaluation, due diligence, and impact measurement is. So one way to think about Open Road as a shortcut is that we are the emergency room of impact. When something goes wrong, when something has broken that's outside of your control, Open Road is there to help keep impact on track. The other set of activities we do, however, if our grants and loans are the emergency room of impact, then the other half of our work and our work with Vera Solutions, as an example, is the preventative medicine around risk management. And here we work on research, advocacy, and partnerships to really maximize impact through a risk management lens. Because one of the things that we've recognized over the years is that many of the real-life examples you see represented in this infographic of what does go wrong represent things that actually don't have to go wrong. There are data points in here that don't have to wind up in our emergency room. And many risks can be prevented, avoided, or mitigated with the right tools and approach. And this is exactly where our work with Vera comes in. Now, I mentioned before that our sector isn't quite prepared, and you might wonder, well, this all sounds well and good, but why do we really need yet another software solution for something? Well, we've done the research, and it is because nothing currently exists. So 76% of foundations don't ask at any point in their application process what could go wrong. 83% don't have any kind of budget for contingencies. So if something goes wrong with one of their grantees or one of their investees, and 65% of funders don't even have a policy, again, let alone a process, procedure, or data tracking program to actually govern off-cycle requests or this inevitable need to perhaps have more funding or some other changes when the inevitable unpredictability strikes. So that's where we are in terms of the sector and risk. And as Zach said, risk today is really where impact was 10 years ago. We do use the word, but it's not well defined. It doesn't have clear measures, and there's not a robust sets of data within individual organizations or across the sector for us to learn from. And that's what we're hoping to start to change with this new module from AMP Impact. So to set us up a little more, I'm just going to take the next 5 minutes or so to take us up a level and really answer this question, what is risk? Right? Like the word impact, it is important to have a common definition because we have learned over the years that there is a difference between output, outcome, and impact. And in the same way, there are some very key and nuanced differences in the definition of risk, which are important for us to understand before we can develop and use a tool to address it. So I'm just going to stop at the top here. This is from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. What is risk? How is it defined? And what I want to draw your attention to is that risk is at its core the interplay of 2 elements. That first element, which is highlighted in green here, is about probability or likelihood. Right, so you've got possibility, chance, probability, chance. Something might happen, and it's always a might. It's never a for sure, and it's never a for sure and not. It's always going to be somewhere in between. The second element of risk that interplays with that possibility is loss, the potential for loss, the potential for harm, for hazard, for losing value. And in our world, what we really like to think of what is at risk, what, in other words, could we potentially lose, is really thinking about impact, right? That is our North Star. It's also, for those of us on this call from the impact sector, in theory, it's why we exist, right? We don't exist to generate profits. We don't exist to generate other returns. We exist to generate impact. So risks to impact are actually the most important thing in our life. There's another side to risk, however, though. If this noun definition of risk is about the objective reality that risk exists in the world, right? Things can always go wrong. The other side is the use of risk as a verb. And here, the important distinction is that action to expose to hazard or to incur hazard, danger. And the fundamental difference between the noun and the verb definitions of risk is that the top one is objective and the bottom one is subjective. So to give a little more clarity to this, going back to that subjective side of risk, this is the idea, the definition of to risk. And this is where all of the language and vocabulary around being risk-taking or being risk-averse. What's your risk tolerance, right? Are you a 1 or a 5 on the risk scale? What is your risk-taking culture as a funder or as an implementer? All of these terms and all of the actions that might emanate from them relate to subjective risk. And subjective risk is fundamentally a choice. In contrast, again, a risk, that noun definition, is objective. No matter what your risk tolerance is, no matter whether you are the most risk-taking foundation or implementer out there, or the most risk-averse one, risk still exists. Period, stop, end. And because of that, this is where the idea of risk management comes in. Right? Because regardless of where we are on the risk tolerance scale, risk still exists in our work. And so if we want to minimize the potential loss of that risk and therefore maximize our impact, we do need to focus on risk management. Beyond this initial distinction between subjective versus objective risk, we can then, under each of those, have many different categories at risk. So which types of risks are we talking about? On the subjective, the risk culture side of things, figuring out what this risk taxonomy might look like is sort of answering these questions. Well, what do you care about and what are you trying to protect? And this, of course, could include financial, right? What is your risk tolerance in terms of financial risk, i.e. how willing to lose money? Reputation risk. This is something that many foundations are very keenly aware of, right? What risks am I or am I not willing to take in regards to my reputation in the field? Governance risk, whether that's compliance for IRS tax law or compliance for 501c3 charity law, or just compliance with internal policies and procedures. This is also another risk that foundations are generally pretty aware of. But again, the one area of risk and risk management that tends to be missing from most practice and what we are really focused on today is impact, right? Risk to impact. So again, that's what I would encourage everyone to kind of keep in their mind as we continue to move forward. We're talking about what could threaten impact. On the objective side, now this is right back into the world that risks exist, whether we like it or not, and many different types of risks do exist. So even with that reality, you can divide it up in a variety of different ways. And again, questions to kind of prompt this would be what could go wrong. So on the objective side, one thing to point out is that we can look at objective risk at different levels. So what's your level of analysis? You can have risks at the portfolio level, at the grant level, enterprise level, program, country, project, and to put this into little more practical examples, imagine you are a funder and you're funding in the space of maternal child health in sub-Saharan Africa, right? There may be certain risks that are affecting your entire portfolio. There are going to be other risks that apply to specific organizations with that portfolio. And there are going to be additional risks further to every specific grant or project to that organization within that portfolio. So what you're identifying as a potential risk event is going to change based on your level of analysis. Another way to kind of start thinking about the subjective side of risk, once you've picked your level of analysis, is to start looking at the what ifs, what could go wrong. And here there are a number of existing rubrics that we can draw on to inform what our list of risks or our categories of risk might be. So some of these you are probably familiar with. There's the PESTLE analysis, which looks at political risk, economic risk, social, technological, legal environment. The SWOT, there's something many of you are probably familiar with, and other ways to approach it. The key thing to point out here is you can structure whatever categories make sense for you based on the level of analysis and based on your risk tolerance and matching that to what you're funding. So just a quick overview, defining subjective risk. Again, risk culture, it's about our choices in the face of uncertainty. Risk tolerance, it's the range of uncertainty we're willing to accept. And the important thing here, it is subjective. There's no right answer. And in fact, these choices can be seen as good or bad. I'm sure we've all heard the call in philanthropy that funders should be risk takers, right? We are the risk capital in society and in the market. So again, being risk tolerant or risk averse is neither inherently good or bad. However, it does involve trade-offs. To put it mildly, you can't expect Tesla-sized returns for investing in municipal bonds. The same goes for impact. You can't expect Tesla-sized impact returns if you're investing in a project that is the equivalent of a municipal bond for impact. So there's always trade-off between risk and return. On the objective side, again, here, two terms to drill down to help bring more precision to our language. So again, this is kind of getting closer to the difference between outcome and impact on the risk lens. A risk event, right? So this is going to be that event, right? What is that thing that went wrong? Did aliens invade? Was there embezzlement? Did a truck break down? Was there a flood, right? Whatever it could be, that is your risk event. And risk management, therefore, are the steps that we take to reduce uncertainty with the goal of minimizing bad, hazard, loss, outcomes, and maximizing, quote, good outcomes. In our case, maximizing impact. So again, on this objective side, risk is bad. Right? There is no risk event that, if it happened, would be a good thing for us. Also very key is that on this side of objective risk is that interplay between likelihood and severity of harm or the undesirable effect. Another thing to really be clear on is that while we can take steps to reduce the likelihood of a risk event, or to reduce the level of loss, the severity of harm that that risk event might have on our project, our portfolio, our grant, we can never eliminate risk. There is no such thing as zero when it comes to risk management. And therefore, the process of risk management is one that is continuous as a feedback loop. It is a process that is never, quote, complete, because you can never reach zero risk. So risk management 101, just a couple other elements to cover that will hopefully provide, again, more of a framework for what Zach is going to demo in the AMP Impact module. We just talked about this a bit, right? These are the two critical elements around risk management that interplay between likelihood and severity of harm. There are also two additional elements when it comes to risk management. So again, this is only dealing on the objective side of risk, the reality that risks exist regardless or not whether we're comfortable with it. And how do we then deal with that uncertainty, deal with that reality to minimize the bad and maximize the good. So likelihood, severity of harm are two key elements. And in risk management, there are two additional elements that we also need to be aware of. And that is influence and control from predictability. So let's not confuse probability with predictability. So probability, right, is the likelihood that there is a change in the presidential administration and that is going to have some kind of effect, right? There is the probability of that change happening is one thing. Being able to predict whether or not that change actually will happen is something separate. This is also really important to call out because there are certainly risks, no matter how hard we try to think about what could go wrong, there are always going to be things that we can't predict or that we didn't see coming. I got a case in point on the presidential elections 3 years ago in 2016. There were all kinds of probabilities out there around the outcomes of the US elections, and very few people predicted it. So that's the predictability, probability piece. And then this influence control piece, again, is also important to point out. Just because you can predict something, or just because you've identified a high probability of something happening, that doesn't mean that you have influence or control over it. So again, not confusing predictability with ability to control, not confusing probability with predictability, but starting hopefully to see how these different elements interact and how we would need to be able to unpack each one of them in order to adequately deal with risk. So here's a frame of some of these different dimensions and how could we look at it, what are we looking, what can we do about it. Mitigate is the idea of steps that you can take in order to reduce the likelihood or reduce the harm of something. Contingency planning is something that we reserve for items that have a high potential of harm and a high potential of likelihood, but are outside of our control to mitigate. So we want a contingency plan for that. If all of this is making you feel a little confused, a little overwhelmed, say, my gosh, how would I tackle this in my foundation? Where would I get started? Good. That's exactly where we were when we started this work 8 years ago. And one thing that we realized is that to really effectively tackle these questions, you do need a system. And luckily, the system of risk management in general is something that's been established. Risk management is an active practice in many other industries, as you may know. And the most simple way to think about risk management or a risk management system is as this cycle. So starting with identify, right? Identify what could go wrong. Here are the 6 things that might go wrong within this project. Taking steps to mitigate. So you go through that prioritization exercise. Here are 10 things that could go wrong, but here are the 5 things that are high likelihood and high severity of harm. That's what I'm going to focus my attention on. Of those 5 things, 3 of them are inside my influence of control, so I'm going to take steps to mitigate them. The other 2 are outside of my control, so that's where it takes us to step 3 on this circle, which is planning for contingencies. And then, just like in monitoring and evaluation and impact measurement, you can't just measure impact once. Snapshots are useful, but they're not complete. And at the end game of a full-blown risk management process, you're monitoring, you're repeating the cycle, and like monitoring and evaluation and a sophisticated impact measurement system, the entire system is actually geared towards continuous learning rather than snapshot reductions of risk, wins, or losses at given points in time. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Zach, who is going to take us into the risk management solution that AMP has built.
Awesome. Thanks, Maya. I really like the kind of breakdown of subjective and objective side of risk. I was at a session at the SOCAP conference in San Francisco a few weeks ago, where there was a really great session on being bold on risk that I think really spoke to the subjective side of it for funders and impact investors, and kind of challenging folks to be bolder in terms of the risk that the risks that they take in the investment decisions that they make. But that session, and actually in general, actually at the conference, there wasn't a lot of talk about the objective side of risk management, which is obviously what we're getting into here, and what the rest of your presentation there was touching on. So let me pull up the presentation quickly, and I'll just take over on a couple slides before I dive into do the demo. So where are we at? So AMP Impact's risk management solution. So I think Maya's given a great answer to this question of why we need to focus on risk and focus on risk management. And as a sector, what do we need to do to strengthen our practices? For Vera, we're very focused on how can we use technology and how can we use the best technology to help organizations solve their challenges, whether it's with respect to impact measurement or grant management or risk management. And I think what we've seen over the years is that for the organizations that are doing this well, many of them are still just stuck on spreadsheets, and they have either Excel spreadsheets or Google Sheets or other forms of spreadsheets that they're tracking kind of risk registers on, and that's at the more mature side of the spectrum of risk management maturity that we've seen with the organizations we've worked with. And so I think that there's a real opportunity here in introducing kind of a new platform-based solution for risk management. So for us, that explains kind of why we're interested in building a risk module. I shared a bit of the background of AMP Impact before, right? We kind of built AMP Impact because we kept seeing these common patterns across both funders and big INGOs and impact investors in terms of the way that it made sense to structure their data, and also found that Salesforce as a platform was really well suited to solving their problems and their use cases. But I think what we've seen is there's this small gap in AMP Impact that we identified was as a real opportunity, was introducing a module for risk management into the portfolio management side of the product. And that's something that we've been working with Open Road Alliance in designing, and Maya will talk a little bit about how we've gone about doing that in collaboration with other foundations.
Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, this is a topic that Open Road has been working on for a number of years. And about 2 years ago, in talking with other foundations, we started to hear the question, okay, Maya, we got it. We need to be budgeting. We need to be asking in our application. We need to be doing something in this risk management space you're talking about. So tell me what to do. Where do I go? And as Zach was alluding to, there really isn't anything out there. If you do want to do risk management, you have to build it yourself. Again, Impact 10 years ago, where there weren't log frames, there weren't templates, there weren't tools, there wasn't these systems for M&E. So we said, all right, let's try and tackle this. We reached out to Vera, we got together, and one of the things we really wanted to do with this first generation risk management software is design something that in theory could work for across our sector. So we brought together 6 foundations that really represented the diversity on the funder side of the impact sector. So we had institutional foundations like Rockefeller, we had family foundations like Siegel Family Foundation, we had corporate foundations like VTOL, we had intermediaries like Global Innovation Fund, Skull Foundation, really a wide swath of foundations that came together over a 6-month period, as you see in this slide, to really move into basically a user-centered design process to try and design something that could work for everyone. And I think you'll see in the demo what I mean. Zach, I think you're on mute.
Aha, I am indeed. A philosophy we've had really from the beginning here is to really start simple. And so in this first version of the risk module in AMP Impact, we've been listening to what the needs are from foundations, as well as what theory and best practice say, and really kind of arriving at a simple Salesforce-based solution that gives us a foundation on which we can build for the future as we get more feedback from grant makers as well as from implementers. Really the tool, rather than kind of tell you all about it, I'm just going to dive in and show it to you. But it really does all the different components of risk management that Maya just covered, from identification through to mitigation and monitoring as well. So I'll just close this here and we'll pop open our demo. Great, and we'll start here. So we're over in Salesforce. You can see we're in AMP Impact here. I imagine we have many folks on the webinar who are already using Salesforce, so I'll spare you kind of a quick tour around the Salesforce platform, but suffice it to say that a lot of what you're seeing today actually is really native Salesforce. You know, you have different types of data that you're collecting, data on that you're managing in the system. AMP Impact brings in a structure for that data. So rather than just having kind of contacts and organizations and opportunities, AMP Impact gives you a structure for grants and projects, for indicators, for geographic areas, thematic areas, and now risk registers, risks, and risk assessments as well. So we have a simple dashboard here that allows us to see the current picture of the current picture of a portfolio of grants, and kind of the risks across that portfolio. So we can see open risks right now. We've got 15 of them, and here's how they break down by our projects or by our grants. So we can see kind of a mix of low and medium priority open risks. We can also see the risk events. So Maya was talking about risk events. So that's when a risk occurs in reality. And we can see in the last 12 months, we've had 5 of these. And we can see a breakdown of them in terms of the actual impact that they've had, low, medium, high. We can see a schedule of risk assessments. So we can see that we had some risk assessments that are in progress here for 2019, a few more scheduled, actually just one more that's scheduled this year, and then a handful that are scheduled for next year. We can also see a breakdown of risks by category, as Maya was talking about. So, you know, impact risk versus financial risk versus reputation risks, and so forth. And then we can also see kind of a breakdown of different types in terms of the long, short, medium term, and the time frame. So I'll drill into an example grant to unpack this a little bit further. So here we've got this grant called Be Safe. So it's focused on advocacy in vulnerable communities. So really trying to drive awareness around emergency safety and security measures in vulnerable communities in the US. Particularly this example grant is in Chicago and New York, I believe, and that's got a funding amount of $200,000. So we've got a lot that, for those of you who haven't seen AMP Impact, there are lots of different components to AMP Impact. Setup data with reporting schedules, geographic areas, objectives and indicators, and much more. So I'm not going to drive into all of those different features. Suffice it to say, there's a lot there. And if you want to check out kind of a general demo of AMP Impact features, you can take a look at ampimpact.org to do that. But what I'm going to focus on here is this new risk tab that we've got. And so we can see immediately I've got a summary of the risks under this grant that have been identified. So these are the open and closed risks. So closed risk might be, you know, a risk that we had identified but never occurred, or it could be a risk that indeed it did occur. We can also see a breakdown of risks by status, by category and by status in the same page here. So I'll drill into a risk register. So risk register is what you would set up when you're in kind of that identification stage. So you would start, maybe you'd have one risk register for a grant, or you might have multiple different risk registers with a different focal area. So in this case, we have a campaign implementation risk register that's been set up here. We can see the details of the risks under that register, and then we can see all of the individual risks, which we can drill into. This can also, like anything in Salesforce, run through an approval process. So if you want to have, let's say, a risk officer who drafts a risk register and then ultimately, submits that for approval when they're ready, they can do that, and that can go through, a single or multiple step approval process, depending on your processes as an organization. You could also, as a foundation, you could also have grantees collaborate on this in a portal or a Salesforce community. And so I'll just pull up all the risks under this risk register. So we've got 9 of them. And we can see kind of a breakdown here. Maya touched on each of these different elements. So looking at the probability or likelihood, looking at the potential impact or the severity of the risk, looking at the proximity, right? So how close are we to that risk happening? And then looking at the degree of control that we have over that risk. And so these are nicely just color coded to give us a quick visual indication of which ones we need to be particularly worried about, like this program quality risk. We need to be a bit more concerned about that risk than we might need to be about these local policy changes, for example. You know, the way that has been that's been classified in here at least. So I'll drill into an example, and a risk register could have 3 risks, it could have a dozen risks, it could have many more as well. And that's, you know, the nice piece of Salesforce here. You've got full flexibility on what's kind of the appropriate scale or number of records that you might have. So I'll drill into an example risk. So this late reporting of impact data risk. So it's a pretty straightforward risk, right? The grantee might be delayed in submitting their impact reports to us. I feel like people are probably nodding their head saying, okay, I think that's a risk. You know, the potential impact of that risk is low, right? The probability of that is fairly high. I mean, based on my experience coming from monitoring and evaluation, I think lots of organizations are kind of coming waiting to the last minute to get the reports in. And then we can see that we have a mitigation strategy that's been identified here. So we have different types of mitigation strategy that might be deployed. So financial assistance if needed, or technical assistance. Or, you know, as Maya mentioned before, sometimes the right thing to do is to do nothing, right? It may be a risk that we don't have control over. It may be, you know, maybe a risk that just the probability or the severity of it is low enough that the right thing to do is not to necessarily take any mitigation steps. In this case, the mitigation strategy is providing reporting email reminders a few weeks before the due dates of reports, and then following up by phone if the report is late. So this is just one example. Within AMP Impact in the risk module, you can, well, actually before I drill into risk assessments, I'll just point out in Salesforce, you also have something called Chatter that allows you to collaborate on any kind of data. So you can do that on risks, you can do that on risk registers. So if I wanted to chat with Rachel about this particular risk, I could drop her a message to say, you know, I think we're due for a follow-up assessment. And she'll get an email to that. It'll bring her straight to this risk, and she can plug in, either have a discussion on the record about that particular risk, or come through and actually do an assessment herself. So drilling down into assessments, assessments in the risk module are really quite flexible. So in this case, this example that I'll walk through now, we'll see that an assessment can be done at the level of an individual risk. So this is I would say this is kind of more advanced. We really designed the module to be to work for organizations wherever they are in their maturity of risk management. So if you're just, if you're just looking at kind of risks across a portfolio or across the organization and doing assessments at that level, this module can work for that kind of structure. And I'll show an example in a moment. In this case, we're actually doing quite detailed risk management on a particular grant where we're assessing an individual risk on a grant. So here I'll drill into this risk assessment. And we can see, this was an assessment done by Barbara, probably could be a typo in her name. And this is a completed assessment. It was done for 2019. In this case, the risk did occur. 3 out of the 4 sites were late in reporting their data. On average, it was 5 days late. The actual impact, as predicted, was low. And this is a continued risk because we have another report coming next year. So this is kind of the type of information you can capture about a risk assessment. You also have the ability with risk assessments to go into much more detail using the AMP narrative submissions functionality. So I'll just pull that up and here we go. So this is a different risk. So this is a risk looking at a risk assessment for an unpredictable security event affecting the beneficiaries. And so this was a risk assessment that was completed in 2018. The risk didn't occur. And we just capture kind of when this assessment was done. What we can do through AMP submissions is we can actually connect a narrative template. So we can have a specific template that's used for all risks, or we can have a template that's used for, in this case, security related risks or financial related risks or impact related risks. And then we can have the user, could be the risk officer, could be the grantee themselves, come through and capture data about that particular risk, whether it occurred, and provide more rich narrative information about what happened, right? So, was there risk due to external security hazard? No. Internal security hazard? Yes. Any other hazards? There's learning in next steps. So what's neat about this this piece of AMP Impact is it's all controlled through a template builder, and you can build out templates really for anything, not just for risk, but let me pull up our submissions page. You can build templates for narrative grant reports. You can build templates for capacity assessments, and so forth. So you've got a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to set up the template. So here's just example of how a template might be built. So this is a more general risk assessment template, asking questions around HR risks, security risks, and policy risks. You can modify the questions in that template. So this is just kind of a yes/no template. But you could also do, set them up on a 1 to 5, or, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so you really can use these templates almost like questionnaires to have staff, either internal or external users, capture detailed data that you don't need to build into your Salesforce data model itself. It sort of sits in these narrative submissions. And these templates can also be downloaded as Word documents as well. So there's quite a lot there. Just to show you really can use all the native features of Salesforce, work around this data structure. So we want to look at list views, for example. We can look at a list view of all of our open risks in the system. There's 15 open risks at the moment. We can see how they're broken down, and if we wanted to, sort them or drill into different risks from here, we could really, we can do that, and see the details of a particular risk. Here's another one: fraud in registering beneficiaries, and we can see how that one has been classified, this sort of risk of internal corruption or fraudulent paperwork or documentation that might be done. So I will pause there. Hopefully that's given you kind of a brief overview of the new risk module and some of the ways that it can be used. I think important to point out here that while it is part of AMP Impact, the objects or the tables of data that you're seeing here, as we call objects in Salesforce, can be connected to any other objects in Salesforce. So if you're using opportunities, or if you're using other custom objects that you've built for yourself, you can connect risk registers to those objects. You can connect risks to those objects as well. This is really one of the great things I think about the Salesforce platform, is that flexibility of the relational database platform, the relational database to create the relationships that we need between different types of data, and create a data model that really reflects what our organization needs in terms of managing its data. So I will pause there. I'll pull back up our last couple slides. Hopefully that gave you a good quick taste of what the risk module can do. And hopefully you guys have been thinking of a couple questions. We've got 10 minutes before it's time to wrap. So feel free to drop questions into the chat, or if you prefer, then you can kind of unmute yourself and ask a question as well.
Thanks.
Yep. Anything you want to add there, Maya, before we, as people are typing out or thinking of questions?
Thank you so much. That's just going to be my point. One thing I want to point out while you all are getting your questions together is that the detailed and expanded capabilities of what Zach just showed you is the graduate level version of risk management, right? Again, think of this as like impact measurement. You can have an impact measurement system that, if that is where you are in your practice, and if that is appropriate for your funding strategy or your implementing strategy, has layers of impact measurement, quantitative, qualitative, log frames, this and that. Or if you're at the beginning of your practice, you can just use that risk assessment piece. Just start with saying, for every single grant that we make, what are the 3 things that could go wrong? And we're going to register that in the risk assessment. And even if that's all you do, if you're just at that 101 phase of practicing risk management, what I really excites me is by taking it out of our head and putting it on paper, putting it into the grant making infrastructure, we're turning that institutional knowledge, we're turning those gut feelings, because risk is something we all think about, just not explicitly. By making it explicit and putting it somewhere, it's now data, and that is now data that we can learn from over time.
Awesome. Great thoughts, Maya. So we've got a couple good questions coming through here. So, so a couple of folks have asked, this looks really great for foundations. Can it work for implementers or grantees or nonprofits as well? And this is a really important and great question. We've designed AMP Impact to work in both contexts, and that may sound kind of crazy, but as I mentioned, we've worked with 300 organizations and a real mix of implementers and grant makers. And what we found is that actually the terminology between grant makers and implementers is not very well aligned in terms of how they name different things in their systems, but the taxonomy in terms of how they need to structure their data is actually very well aligned, especially when it comes to impact measurement, portfolio management, and risk management as well. And so AMP Impact really can be used in NGO context. It can also be used in a grant making context. And we have, there's about 40 organizations now using AMP Impact around the globe. It's actually quite a big mix between NGOs like Norwegian Refugee Council, Finn Church Aid, Tostan, who's in West Africa, kind of implementer running programs on the ground, War Child, managing kind of a global set of programs, as well as funders like the Dell Foundation, the Shell Foundation, USAID, and so forth. So actually, it really works in both cases. But what we find is that we need to tailor the solution a bit to the terminology that's unique either to the organization or to their use case. But the structure of you've got a portfolio of either grants or projects or investments or programs, and then under that portfolio, you're going to track indicators, you're going to track risks, you're going to track activities, you're going to track reports, and so forth. So really good question there with respect to kind of the audience here. And actually the AMP Impact is designed to be a tool that can be used both for foundations and for nonprofits. It does require some implementation in both cases. So I think that's important to point out. We got another question here, which is a bit more of a technical one, which is, does each user, could be a risk owner or somebody who's doing assessments, does each user require a full Salesforce license? This is another important point to hit on. So AMP Impact actually works on any kind of Salesforce license, including platform licenses, community licenses. So you could have risks owned by community users if you had partners that you were working with in risk assessment, or if you had your grantees collaborating with you on identifying risk or setting up risk registers. You could also have internal staff who maybe aren't using Salesforce for fundraising or the sales cloud of Salesforce, but are really just using it for grant management or program management. They could just have what are called platform licenses, which would give them access to AMP Impact and access to custom objects that you build on Salesforce. Cool. And then we had a question here on, let me just check. Can risk categories be customized for different organizations? And Maya, I'd be curious to hear actually from the workshops. If I know they were a while ago now, but if you can recall any kind of, so I'll answer this from a technical point of view, and I'm curious if there's any kind of input from what you heard from different foundations in terms of their categories, if there was kind of overlap or discrepancies there. They absolutely can be customized by any Salesforce administrator. It's just what you saw there in terms of the category is a pick list on Salesforce. So you can easily remove some of the pick list values that come out of the box. You can add more pick list values. You could inactivate other ones. You can translate these into whatever languages you need as well. So that's fully customizable in terms of what's needed on that front. But Maya, any thoughts on the sort of categories? Was there pretty consistent across foundations or quite a bit of difference?
Thank you, Zach. There's a lot of difference. And this is the point, right? Is that risk, because everybody's risk tolerance, that subjective side is different, right? It's different for every individual. It's different for every foundation. It's different for every implementer. Even if you're working in the same space, think about two nonprofits that are both focused on water and sanitation. They have different approaches, and somewhere in those differences between approaches is probably going to be a difference in risk tolerance. Same thing for funders. They might be funding the exact same types of projects, but just like we all individually have different levels of risk tolerance for our own personal investments, so does every funder for their investments in grant making or even impact investing. So yes, because we recognize it does differ, that was actually one of the things out of the user-centered design process that led to the way this module is constructed. Not only are the risk categories can be customized, but everything that you saw there can be customized. So even the label open versus closed, if that terminology doesn't make sense for your foundation or your nonprofit, you can change it to ongoing and this, or active and inactive, whatever it might be there for you, because the vocabulary does change across organizations.
And I would say even at a higher level, if you're, let's say you don't want to do risk registers at the level of a grant or of a project, you want to do kind of higher level or portfolio level risk registers. That's also something that you could do. It just requires a little bit of configuration to get there. So if you remember from earlier on, I was kind of talking about this clicks not code, this clicks not code aspect of Salesforce. That really is kind of why we've kept the modules so native, if you will, right? Really kind of aligned with the native interface of Salesforce, is so that it is nicely adaptable and can easily be built upon. Looks like we've got a couple more questions coming through, and feel free to keep dropping these in. We've got about 3 minutes left. So a question around how our foundation supported I presume the question is sort of in using this tool or in this practice. So is it kind of one-off implementation of this infrastructure, or is it on an ongoing basis? So I can share from our experience, and we're not just working with foundations, we're also working with nonprofits. What we find is there's always some setup that's needed in any AMP impact implementation, but I would say broadly any kind of implementation where you're setting up a software like this that you're going to use for grant management or project management or impact measurement. It's going to need to be adapted to your terminology, to your organization, to your particular indicators and themes. And so for us at Vera, what we'll do is we'll run implementations with clients in helping them design, build, test, train, and then kind of roll out a solution within their organization or their organization and their grantees. And so there is kind of that upfront investment. We've really designed AMP Impact to be, and the risk module is really in the spirit of this, 80% of what everybody needs rather than 100% of what anybody needs out of the box. And that remaining 20%, or sometimes it's 30%, that's where the configurability, the flexibility of the Salesforce platform really comes in. And a big focus of ours is also around capacity building for an organization, so that they're building up that in-house capacity to be able to adapt and maintain a system over time, not to become kind of overly reliant on us. That said, we do provide ongoing support for organizations that want or need it. We've got one more question here around a custom case management system. So this is from Greg. They've written a bit of code to build out their own case management system on top of Salesforce. How could AMP fit into that? And let me just see, it was, okay, cool. So worked with a different partner in building out that implementation, or building out that case management system. So it's a really common question, right? Every organization's Salesforce system is a little different, and that's part of what makes the platform great, actually. So we've designed AMP to be able to plug into any existing data structures in Salesforce. So it can plug into, it does plug into accounts and contacts, for example, out of the box. So if you're tracking cases against contacts, you can also connect your contacts to the projects or grants that you're managing in AMP Impact. And then you can connect those projects and grants to the organizations that are either funding them, or that you're funding, or that are partnering with you in implementing those projects or those programs. So that's part of it. The other cool part of it, and this is probably a topic for another webinar, is that you can automatically aggregate result data in AMP Impact. This is on the impact measurement side of it. From any data structure in Salesforce, from cases or from other program data, you can bring that data up to this indicator and result structure by setting out the logic for almost like a very advanced roll-up summary, if you're familiar with that. You can set up the logic to automatically aggregate that data up so that you don't need to go through a manual aggregation process. Happy to chat more about that offline. Cool. Well, it looks like we are at time, and I think we've gotten through all the questions, which is wonderful. A big thanks to everybody for making the time to join today. Hopefully this was insightful, inspiring. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about risk and risk management. Big thanks, Maya, for teaching us a lot today, and look forward to keeping the conversation going on how we can advance risk management across the social sector.